Hello and welcome to the RPG Blender, where we give lesser played games and forgotten settings the roll the dice they deserve. I'm your host, Game Master George, and today we'll be taking a look at Wicked Ones, currently on Kickstarter for a new print run and funding of the Undead Awakening expansion. It has already well blown past its goal, but the good folks at Bandit Camp were kind enough to reach out and provide me with a PDF copy and preview of the expansion so I could share my thoughts on the game. Now, first things out of the way, while I was provided the review copy for free, I have not been paid for this review. They are not a sponsor of this channel, and I am free to say exactly what I believe. Plus, you can actually get the game free anyway. If you have been a viewer of this channel before, you know that I believe my opinion is only that, mine. It is colored by my own preferences, biases, and history, and will be different from yours. It is for this reason that my review follows the format it does, to not only give my opinion on the game, but to help you determine if this is a game which appeals to your unique viewpoint. So, what is Wicked Ones? Wicked Ones is a forged-in-the-dark tabletop RPG about a group of monsters building a dungeon, launching raids on the surface to gather a horde, and pursuing a nefarious master plan. Along the way, there's pillaging, rituals, concoctions, contraptions, discoveries deep in the ground, dungeon rooms, traps, creatures, minions, and so much more. You build your dungeon together, expanding it through the campaign with no two dungeons ever alike. But is it any good? For this review, I'll present the game itself, its goals, and mechanics as neutrally as I can. I won't cover every rule or go into intense detail here. This is an overview, not a tutorial. The goal will be to give you the basic understanding of the game's fundamentals, to allow you to see how these systems work and determine if the mechanics involved appeal to you. As such, I will reserve any judgment or commentary until the next part. So, how does the game actually work? Well, seeing as this is a forged-in-the-dark game, if you've played one of them before, you should already have a good idea. As a forged-in-the-dark game, General Resolution uses rolling multiple d6 dice and taking the highest value rolled. A 1 to 3 is a failure, a 4 or a 5 is a mixed result, and a 6 is a success. Should you manage to roll 2 6s on a single roll, you instead have a critical success. Improving in an action will give you more dice to roll, while difficult situations may result in less. The usage of these dice comes from a few different sources of rolls. In the base Forged in the Dark system, there are most often 4 types: action, downtime, fortune, and resistance. Wicked Ones expands upon this concept with a total of 8 common roles, 3 for the player and 5 for the GM. The player has action when they attempt something challenging, resistance when they try to resist a consequence, and loot when they determine how well they made out in their last raid. The GM, meanwhile, uses rolls for engagement when they determine the starting conditions of a scene, calamity when they determine if anything bad happens within the dungeon, blowback when they determine how the world above reacts to the player's raid, defensive moves when an adventurer resists a PC action, or fortune when the GM doesn't want to decide on the answer to a question themselves. As you may note, only one of the GM roles is an active one. The rest are either setup related or informational. Actions are always in the hands of the players, with set values needed to succeed, and the GM determining stakes in the form of position and effect instead of a difficulty. Position represents the consequences of failure. This ranges from a dominant situation where the players have an upper hand and the consequences of failure would be minimal, to a deadly situation where consequences could be lethal. Effect, meanwhile, represents the impact a success will have. This ranges from strong, where a greater than normal effect would be had on success, to 0, where even success will do nothing, likely due to an ill-advised course of action. When you know what is on the line, you can choose to take a risky action to gain a better chance of success. This is a dark bargain. The GM, or another player, can suggest a cost of some kind, such as losing an important item, a pack of minions being wiped out, or an ally taking an injury. If the player chooses to accept the consequence, they may roll an extra die on the current challenge. Oh, and the consequence happens regardless of if the roll is successful or not. A bit safer way to gain extra dice is by spending dark hearts. Each character has a dark influence, some innate desire which sometimes comes into conflict with successfully completing their task. When you play into your dark influence, allowing it to compel your actions, you gain a dark heart. This dark heart can then be spent for a single extra die on a future test. Of course, you may not wish to follow that influence. If you choose to resist, you gain stress. Should you ever have 6 stress, you go feral, giving in completely to your dark impulse whenever it compels you. You may also gain stress by activating some of your special abilities, calling for flashbacks, or as a consequence for failure and dark bargains. You reset your stress when you reach the lurking cycle. More on that later. You track your stress through the use of a progress clock with 6 ticks, but that is not the only use of them. Whenever there is a task or challenge which is larger than a single action would accomplish, you utilize a progress clock, a simple circle drawn with 4, 6, or 8 segments. As actions are completed or consequences enacted, the circle will be filled in segment by segment. Once the circle is completely filled, the task is completed or the danger comes to pass. Looking back to the role types, you will notice that many of them for the GM are about quickly skipping past the parts of the scenario which are less action-oriented, the setup phases. Along those same lines, the game discourages overlong planning sessions through the use of flashbacks. By spending stress, you can call for a flashback to a moment in the past where you prepared for the problem you are facing now. This triggers a short scene where you go through the preparatory actions required, so you have whatever counter is needed for the current issue. Each calling has certain things they can flash back to, such as a conniver making plans or gathering information. Now, with the basics of the mechanics, let's talk about the structure of play. Gameplay follows 4 phases: lurking, calamity, raiding, and blowback. Generally speaking, gameplay cycles through the 4 in order, though that is not a hard and fast rule. Lurking is when the wicked ones are laying low within their dungeon. While waiting for the consequences of their last raid to die down, they can engage in various downtime activities, such as improving the dungeon, enacting rituals, or simply celebration. This is the chance for the party to further their personal projects. Dungeons are filled with selfish, evil denizens, and often somewhat haphazardly put together. The calamity phase is where these latent troubles may boil up to dangerous consequences. The GM will roll a number of dice dependent on how satisfied your dungeon denizens are, and the results will determine if a calamity ensues and how bad it might be. While the players cannot stop the calamity, they can try to control the impact of it through a scene dealing with the fallout. Calamity dealt with, it is time to venture out of the dungeon on a raid. Within the raiding phase, the players set some loose pieces of information that guide the coming raid. They will determine what their goal is, who is their target, what is their plan, a quick loose plan, flashbacks are for the specifics, and setting some initial details of your approach. Once set, the GM rolls engagement and the raid begins. With luck, you may bring back plentiful loot. After the raid, it's time to see how much the above world retaliates in the blowback phase. The GM will roll a number of dice dependent on how well the wicked ones stuck to their plan and were successful in their raid. The results of that roll determine how bad of a consequence the players experience. This could be as minor as losing some gear, or a party of adventurers could invade the dungeon seeking to end the threat of the wicked ones. This leads into the last element I would like to discuss, the dungeon. During creation, the players will work together to design their dungeon. They will decide on a theme and set the descriptive atmosphere of the dungeon. Then they will take turns drawing out the starting features of their dungeon, just like a dungeon master would do. This dungeon will be their home throughout the campaign and will grow alongside them. Creatures will be attracted, minions gathered, traps set, and the dungeon expanded. But most importantly, with it you progress your master plan. The master plan is the reason for the dungeon's existence, the ultimate goal of the party. They will choose what their final plan will be and then take steps to accomplish it. This begins with growing the horde, but from there, the party will establish each next step when the previous is completed, continuing this way until the final step and completion of the master plan. And there we have it, the basics of the game of Wicked Ones. Hopefully this has been enough of an overview for you to begin forming an opinion on whether it's a good fit for you and your group. Obviously there is a lot more to the game, but the bits presented here form the backbone of the game. Here out, I will be presenting my own opinions on the matter. If you find yourself disagreeing with me at any point, that's perfectly normal. Every game has a target audience, and a game which is a poor fit for me might be the ideal for you. So take my opinions and weigh them against those you formed from the preview, or maybe that of other reviewers. I'll drop some links to other reviews in the description. The concept of the game is by far one of its strongest elements. Sure, there are other games which put you in the role of playing a monster, but the Dungeon Keeper-esque home dungeon makes for an extremely enticing campaign concept. Adding to this, the game puts the players in the forefront of the story, creating their own master plan and even defining the raids they will be taken on. While many games put players in a reactionary role, seeing the plot of the big bad and working to find ways to stop it, the players here are the big bads, and the game fittingly puts them in the role of planning and enacting the grand evil scheme. The narrative elements of the game well support this structure. The system of flashbacks and the master plan being created on the fly work to give the players some of the freedom GMs have while writing up a plot for their story. This all combines to create an enticing hook for an evil campaign, a concept which often struggles with direction. But this strength does bring with it some issues. The game puts the players in the role of evil creatures doing evil things. As such, there can easily be events which players may have a hard time stomaching. Now, let me say, you should absolutely always set frameworks within your group of topics which should be handled delicately. This may come in the way of a formal sit-down and conversation, or it could be something natural from familiarity with your players. Use as many safety tools as are right for your specific group. With this game especially, it is extremely important to set boundaries. It won't be bad guy NPCs engaging in potentially upsetting behavior, it's the players themselves. So it is vital that you not only have the discussion about how dark you want the game to get, but that you have players who are able to abide by the limitations. If a player makes it clear that there is a topic they do not want included in the game, and another player goes rogue, you have the makings of a future RPG horror stories post and Crit Crab video. Now, on to the mechanics. Obviously, this being based on the very popular system from Blades in the Dark, it already had a good start to its mechanical base. And the ways in which they expand upon or trim away elements from it are done very well. It is interesting that they chose to do away with attribute tests in favor of actions only, and then reduced the number of actions from 12 to 9. But the paring down doesn't get in the way of having an appropriate action for every test. The setting of position and effect is an intuitive system once you get used to it, and using it in combination with progress clocks are your primary tool to keep the pressure on your players, something that can be difficult in a system which eschews the normal target number or number of successes used in most systems. Instead, you need to learn how to adjudicate results of no and yes but, yes and yes and. That was confusing. And using progress clocks in particular can help greatly with that. The utilization of cycles and the dungeons themselves are the biggest strength of this system, however. The cycles form an easily maintained flow of the game, allowing a framework of play which supports the players enacting their master plan step by step. Meanwhile, the dungeon system turns the creation of an adventurer's playground into an actual balanced system. I could see people modifying this framework as a game master of other dungeon crawling adventures. Now, that is not to say it is perfect, of course. discussing the clarity of the rulebook, it does falter ever so slightly, but that is not truly the fault of the writers, but rather the open-ended nature of the system. In a game like Dungeons & Dragons, you have definitive targets and consequences. You either hit the target number and get what you want, within reason, or you miss the target and you don't. The game is full of specific actions and mechanics you use to accomplish what you want, and which limit the kinds of things that you can do. So the question becomes, what do you want to do? Here, however, every result and action is open-ended. There are only 9 possible actions, which cover the wide range of possible things you can do. The "what do you want to do" question becomes less important than "how do you want to do it?" a question which guides toward one of the 9 actions. This is hard to communicate, as evidenced by how many times I have rewritten this section of the review, and the team does an admirable job of doing so here, but it can make for a confusing first read. All that said, what do I think of the game? I love it. This is a game which I would easily recommend to friends, just as easily as online strangers. If the idea of playing a monster, engaging in weird science while building a dungeon and enacting a sinister master plan appeals to you, you will probably be able to overlook any difficulties that may come up mechanically, because the game does that so very well. But as covered earlier, you need to know your group. Your players will be playing evil characters, and that is not something that is right for every player. The game is, in my opinion, at its best with players who can embrace the darkness and still inject some humor. The game also requires significant buy-in by the players, being willing to take suboptimal actions for the sake of story or the character. Yes, this is actually a game where saying, "it's what my character would do," before taking a terribly detrimental action can be a good thing and be rewarded. However, the looseness of the game may not appeal to everyone. If you are hoping for any kind of tactical combat, the game unfortunately abstracts all of that away. A tactical player may take some pleasure from the dungeon design element, but this is a game best suited for players who want to get right to the action and doing things, not getting bogged down in hours of planning or combat rounds. For me, I can't wait to run it. I would love to expand upon the dungeon invasions a bit, such that a guest player could step in and control the adventurers delving into the dungeon, while the party gets to play a sort of co-op GM experience. Anyway, that's my review of Wicked Ones. I hope you learned something about this game. The Kickstarter runs through August 31st, and it includes not just the main game, but the new expansion, Undead Awakening. I've gotten a chance to read the playtest, and, well, everything that I like about the main game applies here as well. And the new touches of undeath, like rot and resurrection, swapping out body parts, and the undead conquest playstyle are great additions to the game. I can't wait for the finished version of it. If you enjoyed this and want to hear about more tabletop games, consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel out. We've got all those things where we can beg for money, but the best way to support is really with a free subscription or thumbs up. If you have any questions about the game, feel free to drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them, if I can. Anyway, thank you again for tuning in, and remember, there's gaming outside the Forgotten Realms.